In this video, I'm going to tell one of the coolest stories I've ever heard and how it's a perfect and powerful and profound analogy for being an entrepreneur in personal development in general and specifically building a coaching business.
Today, I want to talk about the Buddha, the Navy SEALs, and life coaches. I want to give you a visual, one of the most powerful visuals I remember when I first started my personal development journey was 2005, so 17 years ago. It's helped me personally so many times because I understood the process that I was going through in a different way. And it's helped me with my clients, with my content, with my courses, with my curriculum, because the visual is just so perfect for really what personal development is about, and also the process of evolution of almost anything. So the story goes, back in the 1950s, there was a monastery in Thailand that was being moved. And while they were moving all the things that were there, one of the movers or one of the monks saw this huge, like 10-foot tall clay Buddha, and it was all like dirty and just kind of looked weird, but they wanted to move it. And he noticed that there was a crack somewhere in the bottom, I think, and there was light coming from the inside. And that doesn't make sense because clay doesn't give off light. So he started to chip away. And eventually what he found was that there was gold inside there. And then they chipped all the clay away, and it was solid gold. This almost 10-foot tall statue of solid gold. It ended up estimated to be worth like a $250 million, like $250 million or something. And it was kind of puzzling, right? Why do we have this insanely valuable golden Buddha all covered up and just sort of left over here? So as they traced back the history, the best thing that they can assess is that several hundred years earlier, somewhere in the 1700s, the Burmese army was going to come through this monastery, and the monks pretty much knew that they were all going to die. And so they prepared. One of the ways they prepared is by covering up their Buddha, which they hoped the army wouldn't see any value in and just leave. Like they just wanted to cover up this thing that was really valuable to them. And it pretty much played out that way. So the army came through and killed the entire civilization of monks and left this big giant 10-foot clay Buddha. Like, who wants that, right? And then hundreds of years later, it was found. And the way I started this story is how it ends. And somewhere in Thailand, I believe, is this golden Buddha. So it's got this like sacred story behind it, which is a cool story on its own for many reasons. When I heard this story, I immediately equated it to our human journey and how this is what we all do. Like when we think we will be killed or we will be discovered or somebody's going to find out something about us, or we just feel threatened in some way, we cover ourselves up. This clay is a representation of how we cover our own golden Buddha up. We cover it with alter egos. We cover it with identities. We cover it with beliefs. We cover it with insecurities. We cover it with all these layers of protection. And then we walk around with our clay as though the clay is us. And we engage in the world and we learn and we create relationships with our clay. And so anything that we build on top of that clay is not really connected to who we are, because the clay itself is a protective layer. So if we create a relationship with our clay, The other person is not in relationship with us. The other person is in relationship with our clay, and the other person is probably in relationship with their clay. So it's likely that our clay layers of protection are in relationship with their clay layers of protection. And this is just the way that we do things. Like, this is a natural way that we as humans, because we're afraid of abandonment and we're afraid of people not liking us, this layer of protection mechanism, I believe, is uniquely human, and it's a function of, really, it's a function of our ego. And if you remember, the ego's designed to preserve whatever the self-image is, and so the clay becomes our self-image. So even though the clay isn't really truly us, it's not the golden Buddha. Well, it's like everything that golden Buddha was connected to over those hundreds of years, nobody was in contact with the gold necessarily. Everybody saw it just as clay, to the point where they thought it was trash. So when we create all these clay layers, we then think that that's us. And even though those layers are not us, the layers, like the layers have the microphone, right? It's like the layers run the show. They run the show of protection. They run the show of the internal punishment. And we live our lives according to the rules of the clay. And when we connect with the clay, when we have this identity attachment to the clay, then we actually believe that we are the clay. We believe that the clay is us. We don't believe that there's anything inside of us that's not these layers that we've been walking around on. So the personal development journey is really one, it's not about increasing almost anything. I mean, of course, there are things that we got to learn as we maneuver and navigate through life, but this journey is much more about chipping away the layers of the clay that are not you, or melting the layers away that are not you, so that we can reveal the golden Buddha inside. And I think every single one of us has a golden Buddha inside that's been covered up by all these layers. Now, the pain of growth is because it's uncomfortable when those layers get taken off. It's uncomfortable physically sometimes. More so than that, it's uncomfortable emotionally, because we don't know who we are as the golden Buddha. We know who we are as the clay. And the fear of the unknown works in against our liberation, because the fear of the unknown, if we don't know who we are as the golden Buddha, then the fear of the unknown will keep the clay on. It will tell us to not remove the thing that's really not us, because we don't know how to live as us. We don't know how to engage in vulnerable conversations, let's say, or we don't know how to create stuff and share it from our heart. We just don't know how to operate under the clay, because we've been operating as the clay so often. And I want to highlight this piece. The ego is committed to preservation of our self-image. So the ego is never going to give you permission to take the clay off, because the ego is identified with the clay. And the ego wants to preserve whatever we know. The ego's not interested in liberation. The ego's not interested in vulnerability. The ego's not interested in evolution. The ego's not interested in growth. The ego is interested in protection of what's already known. But the ego is so loud, so we pay attention to it. To the ego, removing the layers is the pain. But it's more painful to the soul to keep them on. And one of the themes of these classes and this whole idea of personal development so often is, what are you going to choose? Are you going to choose to avoid the pain of the ego, which is built on the clay that's not you? Or are you going to choose to avoid the pain of the soul, which is inside the golden Buddha that is you? Removing these layers is uncomfortable. I have not found a way to make them uncomfortable. I've only found a way for myself and for other people to value the removal of the layers, because I don't know anybody that wants to live their life as the clay. Truly. I know everybody who's more comfortable living our lives as the clay, if we define comfort as what we know and what's familiar, but nobody really truly wants to live their lives as the clay. So this idea has really helped me in my own journey and with a bunch of clients and in some of our programs, because the intellect needs to be involved at least a little bit, right? I talk a lot about how the intellect is part of the problem and the ego is part of the problem. It's not that the entire intellect is the problem or the entire ego is the problem. It's just when they are committed to holding us back, then yeah, that's the problem, right? The protective commitment of the intellect and the protective commitment of the ego is in our way of growing and evolving and living the life that we want. But the intellect itself is a tool that can be extremely powerful. And one of the things I've learned is that if the intellect understands that there is a process, even if the intellect is uncomfortable with the process, the intellect can understand that there is something that we're doing here. This process might be uncomfortable, but there is something at the other end of this, at the end of this path, there's something that we really truly want. So the intellect can actually become part of the solution if it understands what's going on. If it does not understand what's going on, and you're just asking it to rip these layers away that it knows that it's comfortable with, that it's been attached to for so many years, it's not going to do that. It's not going to want to do that because it has to know that there's some purpose for this. And then your intellect can actually be on the same side as you evolving and you growing. But without an intellectual understanding, if we just force ourselves through, and this is why things like just feel the fear and do it anyway on its own doesn't work for most people, because we don't know what's on the other end of do it anyway. If feel the fear and do it anyway just leads to more fear, and then feeling the fear and doing it is just leading to more and more fear, and it doesn't feel like this is progressing in any way, I'm going to stop feeling this fear because there has to be a reason for it. This is also one of the reasons why affirmations or motivation and just the idea that discipline is going to get you through doesn't work for most of us, because on its own, even though it's true, on its own, without the bigger understanding, the intellect itself is going to resist it. But when the intellect knows there's a bigger game at play here, and actually we do want to live a life of liberation, okay, this is part of the process. All right. It might be reluctant at first, but it will help you go through. And then when you feel the discomfort of the layers coming off, you understand, oh, this is my golden Buddha just getting exposed to sunlight that it hasn't been exposed to in decades. But even though it's uncomfortable, it actually feels good. Even though it's uncomfortable, it's actually what I want. And I'm no longer willing to live my life with all these layers on. So even if it's uncomfortable, it's better than living a layered up life. That's been my experience, at least. The process of what we need to do as coaches to melt the layers is not just for you as coaches, but it's for your clients as well. Any process that you do is going to help your coaching, because you're going to be able to advocate for other people to do the same thing. And what I just explained to you with this golden Buddha analogy is personal development. It's not just building a coaching business. It is personal development. So if your coaching business is designed to help humans transform, everything that I just said is what you'll be teaching people. That's what you'll be coaching people through. And you going through the process of any kind of embodiment training is going to help you be the facilitator of any kind of embodiment training. I took a course that was, I think it was about 7 months or so, and it was all about embodiment. And it fundamentally changed so much, not just in my life, but completely changed my business. And actually, that embodiment training is what led to an explosion of creativity for me. It was shortly after that embodiment training that I wrote and performed a one-man play. And because of that, I've got a couple songs, and I've done a movie, and I've written so many poems, and I've done a couple TEDx talks that are all spoken word poetry. And that has all blossomed actually from the embodiment training that I did. So it's inside of all of our curriculum now, but it also unleashed something inside of me that I didn't even really understand was being locked up. And e-school, to fit into this analogy, is like the process of melting your layers, your employee mentality layers, your chasing layers, your inauthentic layers. It's about melting those layers so that you can become the entrepreneurial Buddha that you want to be. It's not just the Buddha. That's a hugely fulfilling way to live your life. But for those of you that want to build a business, that Buddha's got to be entrepreneurial, right? I just got this vision of the Buddha sitting there, but then kind of getting up and sort of walking around this big gold statue. Like there's got to be an entrepreneurial spirit to it if you want to build a business around it. So, and this is going to take a while. The removal of these layers is not just a weekend. It's not just a motivational process. It's not just a single exercise. We've been living with these layers for decades. So the good news is it doesn't take decades to melt them away, but it also isn't just a single thing. That's why this program, eSchool for Coaches, is longer than any program that we've ever done. It's a full year of support so that we can advocate, facilitate your growth, your creativity, the embodiment of your entrepreneurial spirit, new skills that are attached to the golden Buddha rather than attached to the clay. So many of the rules we've been operating under are rules of the clay. And a lot of the rules of the clay don't apply to the Buddha anymore. Some of the skills that you've learned will, but a lot of the rules need to be relearned or reassociated to your golden Buddha. And this is a process over all the years that we've been helping coaches. This is a process that we know all coaches need because we've paid attention. We paid attention to teaching a bunch of information and why people don't implement the information, and when they don't implement it, why. And myself, why have I not implemented certain things? Or Michelle, why has she stopped? And what was the shift that she went through to completely change everything? And when did clients start reaching out to her? And when did her creativity get unleashed? Like it's actually a very similar process for almost everybody. The timing can differ, obviously, because we've all got our own ingredients, but it's a very similar process of milestones of when the coach, like this is a milestone, and then the coach hits this other stage. And then there's, we're going to go up and down in this stage. And then there's another step up. And when that happens, now the coach explodes into a different identity and the creativity comes and there's flow and then there's alignment and all that. And then there's another stage. There's actually a very similar stage for everybody with details in the timeline, but the stages are what really all of us need to go through. That's what eSchool is a pathway for. It's what we know coaches need, especially transformational coaches, in order to do this work. And it's like Navy SEALs training. I mean, it's not really Navy SEALs training, but for those of you that don't know about Navy SEALs, it's a military program here in the United States, and it's recognized as probably the most brutal training in the world. Like almost everybody quits. And these are, big, tough athletes coming from the military but the training itself is so difficult that 90% of the people quit. And when they quit in the Navy SEALs, they ring a bell. They ring the bell, and that basically says, I can't take anymore. So only 10% of the people, according to what I've heard, I might be off a little bit, but the idea still remains. Only about 10% of the people make it all the way through Navy SEALs training. And I've heard people ask this, or it's like a topic of conversation. Like, I mean, it's almost torture to go through the training. So why would the military put people through that kind of torturous training? Well, it's because of what these people are being trained to do. These people are being trained to go into generally, as far as I know, I'm not an expert in Navy SEALs, but go into other countries, secretive, do operations that almost nobody would be able to do. And I'm not advocating anything. I don't know any of the politics behind all of it. I'm just talking about the embodiment of the training itself. And the reality is, if the training system lowered the bar so that more people succeeded, they would just get killed in Afghanistan because they wouldn't have the training necessary to perform the tasks that they have to perform. So if we lower the bar, that means people won't be as trained. And that means not only will they, the people, probably get killed in Afghanistan, but other people will get killed in Afghanistan and the operations won't succeed. So there's a kind of training that's required for the mission. There's a training that you cannot lower that's required for the mission, because if you don't have that training, you can't fulfill the mission. Now, e-school is not going to be torturous. E-school in no way is going to be like Navy SEAL training. But as I was thinking about it a few weeks ago, what it really is something very similar, because we want you to build the muscles that you will need to fulfill the mission. And what we know is that if you don't have these muscles built, you'll die in Afghanistan, meaning you'll fail in business. Sorry if this is a little too morbid, but I also kind of want it to be blunt, because the reality is, if you don't have the muscles and the skills and the embodiment built, you cannot win. Because there are certain tests in the world of business, especially in the personal development world, and even more especially in the coaching world, which is a wild, wild west. There are certain muscles that are required. If the muscles aren't built, the person will fail. It's just that simple. There are very few programs out there, from my perspective, that are building the muscles. Most of the programs are building compensation and selling fantasies that says you can do this thing without the muscles that are required. You can just do this thing. And I'm not willing to do that. I want you to have the embodied skills so that your mission can be fulfilled. And if you don't build the skills, then the mission won't work anyway, because the mission is based on the clay. I want the skills, the embodiment, to be based on your golden Buddha. If you like this video, check out that one right there, where I break down how to become a successful life or business coach in 8 lessons.
But I shifted from chasing the success to mastery. Like, I started to focus on mastery. And